KPFA's own Anita Johnson is our host tonight, and she began her journalistic career at Youth Radio in 1994. She was the senior producer for Youth Radio's weekly talk show on WILD 94.9 and served as a senior producer for 106.1 KMEL's Street Knowledge, hosted by Davey D. By 1997, she was submitting national segments to Marketplace and NPR's Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Weekend Edition. In the year 2000, Anita co-founded KPFA's Hard Knock Radio, a public affairs program covering news, views, and hip-hop. Let's welcome Anita.
So first, as she just said, my name is Anita Johnson, and it is my pleasure to introduce Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus, University of Mass Amherst, as well as the New School University in New York. He's the author of a number of books, including Capitalism Crisis Deepens. Richard Wolff is an American Marxist economist well known for his work in economics, methodology, and class analysis. He has rapidly become famous as well for his Pacifica Network radio program, Economic Updates. I'm hoping that a lot of people have been listening to that. This is a program, much like Hard Knock Radio, that is also syndicated, and his program can be heard on more than 60 radio stations. Additionally, Professor Wolff has made appearances on a variety of different TV shows, radio shows, and films, including The Young Turks, Moores and Company, Charlie Rose, Al Jazeera America, just to name a few. And once again, it is with great pleasure we bring to you Richard Wolff. So please join me in giving him a warm round of applause as he walks his way and makes his way to the podium.
I don't want Ken to hit this, so can you all hear what I have to say? Okay. Well, I wondered to myself what might be a good way to start us off this evening. And so I thought that maybe it would be a good thing to say thank you to the individual who, in a sense, has done so much in the last few weeks to build the attendance here this evening, to increase the money flowing to everything left of center in the United States. It's half with humor, but half with seriousness. He is our best organizer for the moment, and seems determined to stay that way for as long as possible. So I do want to begin, since some of the other things I might have to say are of a different style, that at least on this score, he's doing good work despite himself. One of the things that has happened in the United States over the last several years, and which is carrying me as a phenomenon, which I'm happy to say is in pretty good shape so far. Maybe I'll start with an announcement, because a little bit about what's happening to me is like what happened in the sense of producing Occupy, and what produced Bernie, and what produced a number of things that are now adding up to a change in the way this country works. Anita kindly mentioned 60 stations. We're actually on 75 stations now in the United States. Those are radio stations. We're also on 2 television stations, one here in the Bay Area and one in New York City. And I hope within the next 2 or 3 weeks to be able to announce that we will be on many, many, many more television stations here in the United States, which is a sign that something is changing in America in terms of what's allowable. I came out here to do this talk, as I have done the last few years, but I'm also pleased to be able to come out here and spend next Monday as a guest of the Sonoma State University in Rohnert Park, where I'll be speaking and talking, and the topic they asked me to discuss, this is the president of the university, is they would like me to discuss the criticism of capitalism. I understand, and I'm sure many of you know this better than I, that Sonoma State has a history that perhaps makes this not so surprising, but I can assure you that given my life in the United States, for a president of a major university to invite a speaker to give a critique of capitalism is a new development and is one that suggests things are changing, and changing fast. And indeed, that's partly my theme for this evening. I will try to have the caustic wit that your title suggested. I'll do my best, but it's been raining, and so I don't know if I can. What happens in a capitalist system is always partly the dynamics and mechanisms of the system itself, and then things that happen in the larger context. Those things interact to give us the history that we're living through. This system, and let me, in a sense, give you the punchline before I work out why I think it's true. This system is in the most severe difficulty that I have been able to ascertain or see in my lifetime. If I have anything to suggest to you, it is that this system is in trouble, bad trouble, does not know exactly why, does not know what to do, and is beginning to thrash around like a system in deep trouble that doesn't know what to do. When the crash hit in 2008, it was already clear to folks at the very top of this system that something had to be done to prevent the vast left wing of the United States from reacting to the stunning failure of capitalism to function in 2008 by getting up and saying something. It found an attractive, handsome, young, well-spoken man of African-American heritage to become the president of the United States in the hope that this would quiet the left, which it did. It was as far as they thought they needed to go to contain the situation, and by and large, they were half right. The situation was contained in terms of the opposition that might otherwise have materialized. But it was nowhere near enough to deal with the underlying mechanisms of this system's inability to function, which is in large part why 8 years later, the logical successor to Obama, Mrs. Clinton, was defeated. The system didn't work well for people. It took 8 years to demonstrate that it couldn't fix itself real well either. And so it became a relatively easy shot for someone to say, it's not working real well, and to find an echo and to find support, especially as against a candidate who insisted it was working real well. This was not a good arrangement. But the underlying system wasn't working. The recovery didn't affect most of the people in the United States. They weren't recovering. The fundamental things they want, a decent job, a decent income, the ability to live their lives, to have some time off, to make their kids able to have a vacation and an education, these were not coming down the pike. They were shrinking ever further away. And all the dancing of all the economists and all the pretensions didn't change that reality on the ground. And when it came time to go into the booth, people acted it out, as usually happens. The problem was that the underlying mechanisms continue to push in the wrong direction. The troubles mount. The difficulties aren't going away. What do I mean? The big problems for capitalism as a system aren't new, they're old. They've been contained sometimes, but when you can't contain them, then they spread. They're like a disease. The first one is instability. This crazy quality of capitalism that every 4 to 7 years, down it goes. And we have words: crash, downturn, recession, depression, all the words that a vocabulary can develop for something everybody knows, everybody sees, everybody feels. There's that wonderful song of Leonard Cohen's, "Everybody knows." And they do, and they do. And this system has tried everything to cope with that instability. It has tried monetary policy and fiscal policy and tax cuts and government spending and stimulus, you name it. An entire branch of economics, my profession, is devoted to something called Keynesian economics, whose whole effort is to try to manage this instability. The goal was always make the instability go away now and make sure we don't have any more of these downturns in the future. Every president of this country since Franklin Roosevelt promised that if we only did what he suggested, and this is true for Republicans and Democrats alike, not only would the current economic downturn go away, but we wouldn't visit this horror onto our children. Every president promised it. No president ever delivered on the promise. It's a failed project. If you don't want instability, you can't have capitalism. But that's been a difficult line to pursue in this country for 50 years. But it's getting easier, much easier. It even went down just now better than it normally does. The second quality of this system that's as old as this system is the quality called inequality. The fact that this system produces ridiculous levels of unequal wealth and income. Oxfam, that remarkable British outfit that studies inequality, came up with that wonderful number a few months ago, that 68 of the richest people in the United States, in the world, own as much wealth, the 68 richest, mostly Americans, by the way, not all, but mostly. They include favorites like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, and unfortunately not Donald Trump. Those 68, or it may be 86, as you can see in a moment, it really doesn't matter. They have as much wealth together as the lower half of the population of the planet, 3.5 billion people. I really shouldn't have to say much more than that, should I? What kind of a system works like that? What possible justification is there for making half the world's people poor so that 86 or 68 or whatever the number is can have tens of billions of dollars each? But it doesn't even begin to exhaust. If you know the reality, you know that the poorer half of the people of the world are the ones who die at an early age, are the ones who have every disease in the book, peculiarly those that are curable above all, because it doesn't get to them. They can't get the doctor or the medicine or the attention. If you took away half the wealth of the 86 richest, they'd still be the 86 richest, only you could transform the lives of 3.5 billion people. For those of you that take ethics, morality, or religion seriously, how in the world do you support an economic system that works like that? In 2014, Thomas Piketty, a very important French economist, who, by the way, works very closely with his colleague, Emmanuel Saez, here at UC Berkeley's economics department, Gabriel Zuckman, a whole crew of people who work right here in the neighborhood. They produce the best statistics on world inequality anywhere on this planet. You're right close by, and they make it all available for free on the internet. Take a look at it sometime. It'll give you one statistic to make you gasp after another. Piketty's book showed us once again that everywhere and anywhere that capitalism has settled into the world as the dominant economic system, which is now most of the world, it has produced growing inequality as the way it works. It keeps doing that until the mass anger that builds up explodes. And then for a short time, inequality is reduced until the crisis passes and the basic mechanisms kick in again and we start again. In this country, the 1930s was a time when we compressed inequality dramatically. But as soon as that crisis was over, as soon as the Depression had given way to the war, and the war came to an end, and Roosevelt died, and the alliance with the Soviet Union ended, all of that was rolled back. That's why in this crisis that we've had the last 8 years, there's not a whisper of a public employment program. The very thing that Roosevelt did, we couldn't even discuss it in this country, let alone do it. All of the gains, all of the inequality that was reversed was allowed to blossom. Capitalism normalized itself, and in the last 4 or 5 decades, reproduced a level of inequality even greater than what led us into the Great Depression of 1929. It's almost as though we were a nation of people who couldn't learn some of the most basic lessons of our own immediate history. What's the matter? This is a system that is unstable and produces inequality on staggering scales. And when the inequality hits and when the instability hits, the mechanisms of this society are to push down and blame and punish the poorest and those who have the least to do with it as a kind of hysterical bad joke on a situation. Look at us today. An economy riven by the instability. We're living through the second worst collapse of capitalism in its history. We're living through levels of inequality that I've quoted to you and that you know real well. So what have we decided as a nation is the urgent thing for us to do faced with a capitalism exploding in inequality and instability? Beat up on immigrants. What? A nation of 330 million people is all exercised over 5 to 10 million undocumented immigrants brought here to do jobs at salaries most Native Americans will not accept, under conditions that they will not accept for good reasons. That's our problem? We're going to run that game again? For the umpteenth time in thousands of years, a leadership in a society falling apart finds some external person to blame. Some immigrant, some foreigner, somebody who looks different, smells different, tastes different, eats differently, wears their clothes different. Stop. At some point, the sheer immaturity of this is too much. We're going to have this run again? It really staggers the mind. What kind of a society would behave like this? You know, Mr. Obama's administration got rid of 2 or 3 million immigrants. It's not starting with Mr. Trump. It got its start earlier. There's no way out of that. It didn't help the Democrats that they were pushing in that direction. It's not going to help Mr. Trump either. It doesn't solve the problem. It does nothing for instability, and it does nothing for inequality. It hasn't in the past. There's no reason to presume it will in the future. I'm going to go through a little of that with you in a few minutes, but it's the big picture I don't want you to lose. So what are some of the internal and external causes for the economic mess we're in? A mess that gives us a government that can't quite get its act together, that is too extreme, that says too much, that doesn't know how to keep its own house in order. These are signs, folks. They're signs of a system that's falling apart, and it doesn't know what to do. And while on the one hand you might be interested in the opportunities for the left that creates, which it does, you also have to be mindful of what it means if the strongest and most militarily powerful society on this planet is disintegrating and half knows it. And its government knows it for sure. So first, the outside mechanisms, then the inside mechanisms that explain it. The outside mechanism, and I cannot overstate this, you have to understand that in the last 30 to 40 years, hundreds of millions of human beings who were outside the world capitalist economy for a variety of reasons. I'm talking about the people of China and India and Brazil and so on, were brought in. This was partly the effort of the West, the capitalist developed world, in what we euphemistically call globalization. But it was also the effort of the governments of China and India and Brazil, who wanted what? Work for their people, jobs for their people, income for their people. So suddenly, hundreds of millions of people outside the capitalist world were brought inside. And they were desperate for work. And they offered to work. And they offered to work for very little. That radically altered the relationship between capital and labor, business and workers, employers and employees. Imagine yourself a business someplace and suddenly the available labor supply triples, quadruples. Not just that, people who are desperate and will work for next to nothing. It's a wonderful time to be an employer. Oh boy, are you going to do well. And it's an awful time to be an employee, because you're going to be outcompeted, outmaneuvered, and outhired by all those desperate people. And the people of China and India and Brazil turned to the capitalists of Western Europe, North America, and Japan and said, "Come get us. Bring your jobs. Bring your factories. Bring your offices. Bring it all. We've got more than enough people to work. They're eager to work. They'll work real hard." The minimum wage in Bangladesh today is $38 in the garment district per month. How are you going to compete with that? The answer is, you're not. It's not a question of whether, it's only a question of when. The jobs are gone. Millions of them. And they're not coming back, and Mr. Trump can stand on his head. It's not going to make any difference. Unless he's prepared to make up a huge section in this country of jobs, also paying $38 a month, which he knows he can't do. Capitalism is awash in excess labor. Remember the little lessons of supply and demand you learned in school? If the supply of labor is virtually limitless, then the price of the labor goes down. You know how that's experienced? Your wages stop rising. even though you thought they were supposed to go up each year. They don't. And that pension you have, you don't. And those holidays you used to have, you don't. And the security of that job, it isn't there. You get it? Bit by bit, here this way, there that way, this job in this way. It doesn't matter, it'll all work out. You're going to lose. That's what this external reality is about. Wages over the last 6 or 7 years have been declining in the United States and soaring up in China. That's the reality. What are you going to do about this? Well, it can rise in China because it started at such a low level, but it makes a fortune for people who are employers. Because for them, the cost of labor has gone down. Everything else pretty much the same. The cost of labor has gone down. And so there's more profits for them, which is why the stock market is a great place to be. Because you get a piece of that action, the profit boom that comes when labor explodes. But what about the mechanisms inside capitalism? Well, let's be clear. It's a two-way street here. What are the mechanisms inside capitalism? Easy, but very important for us to be clear about. Capitalism is a way of organizing production, organizing the production of goods and services that we depend on, food, clothing, shelter, vacations, you name it. We organize that in a very particular way. We set up businesses in which a very small number of people, shareholders and the boards of directors that they elect, make the decisions about every store, every factory, every office. They tell the mass of workers, you and me, what to do. Come to work at such an hour, sit over there, work with this machinery on that raw material, and at the end of the day, when you're finished doing all this work, please go home. Have 4 beers, 6 pizzas, and come back tomorrow and do it all again. And smile while you're doing it. That's how it's set up. Private enterprises. And each of these enterprises aims at the same thing. It's called profit maximization. They want to make the biggest difference between the revenues they get from selling whatever it is they make, the most money they can, at the lowest cost of making anything. Pay the least for your tools, equipment, raw materials, and labor, and get the best price you can for whatever it is you use those inputs to produce and sell. Because the more profit you make, the difference between revenues and costs, the better off your business will be, the better you can compete, the sooner you can grow, the better you will outwit your competitors. They all have to look at ways of making more money. It's a compulsion built into the system. The system isn't compulsive because the people are, it's the other way around. So how have the capitalists been doing these last few decades? Real simple. Step 1, if you can get away with it, leave the United States. Get out of here. Why? Because this is a country where capitalism has flourished for 200 years, and in the course of that, trained its working class to demand decent wages. Decent working conditions. And the capitalists didn't want to give them. They had to be fought for, but they were won. And the minute a capitalist loses that battle, has to pay decent wages and good jobs, in that moment, the capitalist is looking for a way to fix that situation. The reward to a working class in capitalism from successfully struggling for wages and better working conditions is to threaten its own job. That's the absurdity of this system. The more you win, the surer your loss will be. And one way that we lost in the last 40 years is companies left. They went to Bangladesh or China or India or Brazil. to make more money. No secret, no mystery, nothing special, very mundane. If they could leave, they did. The courageous ones left early. The other ones were afraid, you have to learn another language, work in another currency, take all kinds of risks. You don't want to do that. But when the early ones went over there and made a ton of money, everybody else got on that ship real quick. Otherwise, they wouldn't survive. Which is why all of you are sitting there in foreign underpants. Don't look down now, but later, check. Check. The businesses that couldn't go away to get cheap labor did that other thing. They brought the cheap labor here. If you're a grower of a plant or a raiser of an animal, you can't move overseas so easily because you're stuck with the land and the climate and the soil, and so you bring the cheap labor here. If you run a restaurant for customers here, you can't move to Bangladesh. They probably won't follow you for dinner. So you've got to bring the cheap laborers here, which we did, didn't we? And that capitalism that I criticize so often, it's that capitalism that developed the world so unequally in the first place. What kind of crazy system develops enormous wealth in Western Europe, North America, and Japan, and staggering poverty in Asia, Africa, and Latin America? That's uneven development. That's unequal development. And you know what that does? It produces horrible poverty at one end and enormous wealth in the other. And now scratch your head and marvel with me. It turns out the people who live in those poor areas are thinking of leaving and going to the ones where there's lots of wealth. How bizarre. How inconsiderate they are. Why don't they stay and drop dead where they live? And rather than come and sleep in doorways here. It's a system that produces these results. And so our capitalists either made more money by going over there for cheap labor or bringing the cheap labor here. And for those capitalists who couldn't do either of those two, there's one more way to make more profit and survive. We call that automation in economics. It's to replace the expensive worker, not by going abroad to where the cheaper workers live, not by bringing the cheaper workers here, but by replacing expensive workers with robots and computers. Notice the thing that is in common here. You're screwing the workers here in the United States either by leaving, by bringing cheap competitors, or by replacing them with a machine. The common element, you're screwing the American working class over and over again. And what did you imagine? That it could go on forever? Is that the capitalist's great dream? Too bad. Doesn't work like that. You keep doing that and eventually it pushes back. It says, no, 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 no. How it pushes back, when it pushes back, that depends on the culture. That depends on the history. So let's do a little of it for America. Once upon a time here in the United States, when capitalists pushed too hard, let's take the 1930s as the example, the working class did finally say, we won't have this anymore. And suddenly we had taxes on rich people go very far up, and government programs to help the masses of people. Social Security, unemployment compensation, the first minimum wage we ever had, and that government employment jobs program I told you about before. We really had a working class that said, hey, your capitalism is real nice, but when it breaks down, don't take it out on us. Oh, no, 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 no. You pay the taxes. You pay the higher minimum wages. You cover the job guarantee that the government will provide. You, the rich and the corporations. Yeah, that's what we did as a people. We have something to be proud of. Unfortunately, it was long ago. The people who we did that to, who run this country, they didn't miss this. They noticed. They noticed real well. And when that war was over in 1945 and Mr. Roosevelt was buried and put away, they went to work to undo all of that. And the first thing they did wasn't just roll back the taxes. That took decades. They knew that before you could get rid of the rules and the taxes and the policies, you had to do the key thing, was get rid of the movement of working people that made all of that happen. And that was an alliance in the 1930s. Some of you have heard me talk about that before. The alliance of the socialist parties, two of them, the Communist Party and the CIO, the labor movement. And that's what happened from 1945 to 1985. The rollback of the New Deal by crushing the left movement in this country, every bit of it. You started with the weakest link, the communists. Instead of them being the vanguard, the leaders of this pushback of the working class, which they largely were, you transformed them into evil agents of a foreign power. Here we go again. Immigrants, don't you know? Foreigners who don't really love us and not really like us either. So we got rid of them. We deported them when we could, imprisoned them when we could. But most important, went around the country telling everybody, this is an awful thing, this communism and this socialism. Don't get anywhere near it. Don't ever go to a meeting where there are people who sound or hint or even smell like they might be that way. Avoid it, or you'll be in trouble. The American left, with all due respect, us, took that lesson to heart. And we became very quiet and very frightened. Which meant that if the working class was going to push back against what's being done to them, it couldn't take a left-wing direction. That was too scary, and the people who would have normally led were afraid to. So it took another direction, didn't it? It took a direction of the Tea Party, which stood up and said, hey, this is unacceptable, what's going on here. It took a right-wing form because that's what's allowed in this country and has been for decades. Of course it would go in that direction. Of course it would put a Trump up there and a Bannon and a Sessions and all of that collection. Those are the right ones. They can express rage, anger, and change in a right-wing way because it's always been allowed in the last half century, the way the left never was. The left is afraid for good reasons. Those were hard decades, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. I understand that. I lived through it too. But we can't afford that because we cede the field to another kind of opposition to the realities of our time, to the destruction of working class standards of living. And then we can't really be surprised, can we, when they rise up and embarrass us that they are taking the leadership in pushing back, that they are doing it in a way we don't approve? Of course not. Because they've been free to do it precisely because they don't do it the way we do it. But we are ceding the field to them. So part of the blame for their being able to do what they're doing, including Mr. Trump, is us. And if we don't change that behavior, if we don't overcome that fear, it will continue. What are we going to do? That's the big question. It really is. So let me conclude with that. What are we going to do? Some would argue that we need to have rules and regulations. Bernie proposed rules and regulations, who wanted us to remember Roosevelt, even spoke explicitly about Roosevelt's behavior and Roosevelt's policies and why they could and should be instituted again. But we have to be hard-nosed here for a minute, whatever we think of the achievements of Bernie's campaign. What Roosevelt did was taken away after he left. What Roosevelt did was not secure. And the insecurity of what he achieved, we now have to live with. The people to whom he appealed to give a better standard of living have decided for their own reasons to take it away again. That's why Social Security, instead of being a real secure way to face retirement, isn't. That's why there is no public employment program. That's why the real value of the minimum wage has been declining for 20 years, et cetera, et cetera. The mistake, and there's no nice way to say this, the mistake of Roosevelt and of Bernie is to imagine that there's any way to be secure about a decent income, a decent job, and a decent life in this society while you are bargaining with somebody who has every incentive to take it away from you. What are we doing? We're going to do it again? Are we going to have a mass movement to put down these rules and regulations again? The ones that Roosevelt passed? We're going to have a stronger Dodd-Frank? Are we going to have a stronger unemployment program? We already know what happens when you do that. You've created the incentive for the other side to take it away. By moving the jobs abroad, by bringing in the immigrants here, by automation. I'm not going to go through it again. You know the story. The hard reality is the only way to secure the reforms that Mr. Roosevelt achieved with mass support and that Mr. Sanders reproposed 70 years later with mass support, the only way to get those to be secure is if we're not bargaining with the enemy anymore. Here's the irony of history. There was a debate between reform and revolution back in the 1930s. There were people who said in those days, no, Mr. Roosevelt, don't get laws and regulations and rules, because if that's all you do, the people you're getting them from will take them away as soon as they can. Don't do that, make a revolution. They had that debate. The revolutionaries lost and the reformers won. Okay. They got their chance. They made the reforms. They blocked the revolution. Here we are 60 years later with the result. The reforms got taken away, and we're back at the debate. But we've been there, and we've done that. We did one. It's time to think about doing the other one. And what does that mean? And what does that mean? I'm not here talking about the barricades, romantic as they are, and the street battles, which probably are coming. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a concrete idea of how do we go about making sure that this time, when we confront the Trumps, the Sessions, the DeVoses, all of them, we don't demand and fight for something which 10 or 15 years from now they'll take back, even if we win. We've got to do that which will make them permanent. We've got to recognize that there's only one way to secure decent work, decent income, decent lives for all of us, and that is if we run the businesses of this country and don't fight with other people who don't want that. Very briefly with me, one more time. If the workers in an enterprise get together, one person, one vote, to decide whether to close their enterprise here in Oakland or Berkeley and move to China, I make you a prediction. They won't do it. It destroys their own job. It destroys their neighborhood, their family, their community. It deprives their community of the taxes a successful business pays. They won't do it. You want to deal with the problem of jobs leaving for China or India or Brazil or Mexico? Real easy. Democratize the enterprise. Problem solved. Here's another example. Suppose the wages and incomes of working people in America, of all people in America, were decided in each store, in each office, in each factory, by a democratic assembly of people deciding how do we divide the revenue that we've all helped to produce. Would some people be given enough money to have $1 billion accumulate in their account while other people can't send their kids to college? It's not going to happen. It's not the way communities of people work. They're not going to do it. They're just not going to do it. And you know something? A society that doesn't distribute its income unequally in the first place saves itself the agonizing battle over redistribution later. That's right. Think about it. For me, the example is clear. If you have 2 children, little ones, and you're going out for a walk to the park, imagine that you buy 2 ice cream cones and you give both of them to one of your children. And then you give them a lecture about the moral imperative to redistribute the ice cream cones. That's what we do. And you pressure the child with the 2 to give one to the child who got nothing, thereby producing an enmity between your children that will last a lifetime. Wouldn't it be just a tad smarter to give them each an ice cream cone right at the beginning? Then there is much less trouble, even if one of them got a slightly bigger than the other one. We live in a society which tears itself apart about redistribution and can't imagine that the alternative is to not distribute it unequally in the first place, which a collective democratic mode of distribution would be a quick way to achieve. You want to deal with the inequality and the instability? Come on. Any group of workers would understand tomorrow that if there's a decline in demand for one kind of worker, the solution isn't to fire them. The solution is to find something other useful in the community that needs being done and have them do that for a while. Have them be moved to a place where you need more workers so they can move. These are not difficulties. But in capitalism, they're difficult because for a capitalist, when the demand for what he produces goes down, they want to save money. They need to cope. They want to fire people. We know these things. You don't need me for this. I appreciate the kind words that some of you have when I explain it, but you know all this. You know it because it's common sense. And economics is just the codification of common sense about these things. It gets obscured when you need people not to see all manner of things. The solution for our problems lies in a reorganization of the workplace, a transformation so that the decisions that we need as a people are what guide the enterprise, not the profits of a small group of shareholders and leaders, but the needs of the society as a whole. That's what we need. The older efforts at socialism and communism, the words that were used by people who knew the problems of capitalism in the 19th and 20th century. They wanted to make public enterprise instead of private, planning instead of markets. Interesting ideas, perhaps ways of moving forward, but they didn't deal with the base of society. That daily experience in the office, the factory, or the store. That has to be transformed if we are all going to be the democratic and collective people that can make this stuff happen. Look, we can transform the awful moment of Trumpism by seeing the opportunity that it represents, by helping our fellow citizens see this as a sign of a system that's breaking down. I am not an alarmist. I did not believe in 2009 or 10 or 11 or 12 that this system was breaking down. Yes, it had a serious crisis. Yes, it had suffered. Yes, it was in a bad capitalist way. But I thought to myself, capitalism has been through crises before. It's a kind of resilient system. The predictions of its demise have been premature. There's an old joke about Marxist economists that they're terribly proud of having predicted the last 10, they predicted 10 of the last 4 downturns. I get that joke. It's funny. I accept it's good criticism. But the reality remains, we've learned something. We've learned from the successes of that socialist movement. It was a success, you know. Marxism and socialism spread from the 1880s to today, 140 years, to every corner of the globe. It's one of the most spectacular spreads of any idea in the history of the human race. So before we're so quick to condemn and to dismiss, wow, they must have done something right. But they also did horrible things. We know what they are. We live in a society that still thinks the Soviet Union is an enemy. Finds it intolerable that Mr. Trump is not moved by the argument for his own reasons. We can learn from the experience of the earlier socialists, even as we decide to go in a different direction and to do things they didn't do, like transform the workplace. Not simply replace the private board of directors with a group of government officials. This is not quite enough. Something radical has to be, we're learning what that is. You want a counterweight to too much government power? Then give the mass of people in the workplace that power by giving them the enterprise, by giving them the control, by giving them the wealth without which no state can function. There's a balance of power, much more powerful than anything else that's been discussed so far. We know what we need to do. The real problem, and I'll end with this, that I leave you with, that I feel very personally because I travel around the United States now with a freedom and a level of interest that I'm still not quite adjusted to. I spent too many years of my life on the edges of what's allowable to be said. I can't quite get over it that I can say it all now. And not only is it okay, but people pay me to do it. And in America, there's no greater sign of acceptance than that. But seriously, folks, it depends on you. You've got to stop being afraid. I know that it's not comfortable to think of yourself as afraid. None of us wants to do it. But we all grew up in the United States that had a very deep and very effective kind of repression. Not the kind where you're yanked off the street, horrible as that is, but one that in its own complexity runs deeper than that. A kind of psychological instinct against group activity, collective activity. Your individuality is going to be submerged. Your individuality is going to be disrespected. You're going to get caught up in something very bad and very dangerous, and your mother always told you not to do it. And she meant well for you. You knew that, even if there were moments when you weren't so sure. That runs deep in all of us. In my own humble opinion, it's the single most important issue that prevents this system from becoming able to finally confront its own contradictions. The things inside itself that have been postponed and delayed and obfuscated for so long, but kind of now are saying, you have to deal with us. Otherwise, what? Well, I promise to end with this. I really do. I'm not an alarmist about the environment, partly because you have other people who can do that with you and for you. But it is scary what they're going to be doing as they roll back the few protections and few regulations we want in some mad rush to have another few years of fossil fuel billions. It is kind of scary. It took a long time to build up a public education system, and we now have a leader who seems to want to undo it, whose first act is to lower requirements for our schools so that the miserable charter school movements and others can survive, because otherwise they couldn't. A labor secretary who can't spell the word, etc., etc. It is scary, but these are lessons. It can be taken away. If you don't make the changes that have to be done, it's going to be taken away. Let me remind you that if we don't act, there's a lot to be scared about. A lot. Mr. Trump is not the last word in horrible. There are horribles yet to come. They're waiting in the wings. When this doesn't work, then there will be the next one. The word fascism is used a little too quickly these days. At least if by fascism you mean what happened in Germany or Italy or Japan and so on. But it is certainly a proper insight to see what we're looking at as a step in a direction that could take more such steps. The left is once again the final issue. What saved capitalism in the 1930s was not Mr. Roosevelt. It was the left. It was the left that stood up and said, you're going to give us unemployment insurance, you're going to give us minimum wage, you're going to give us public jobs, you're going to give us Social Security, you're going to do all those things, and you're going to tax rich people to pay for it, which was done. And so the United States came through the Great Depression without the fascism of Germany or Italy or Japan, or the virtual collapses of France and England and so on. It was the left that made that happen. It wasn't the great ideas of John Keynes. It was the left that said, you're going to spend on us, and you're going to tax the rich to do it. And if you can't tax it out of them, you borrow it from them. One way or another, you're going to... That was Keynesian economics, but it wasn't with Mr. Keynes in the mind. It was the left that did it. But the irony of ironies was, you saved capitalism. And what a terrible mistake that was. Mrs. Clinton was wrong. The goal is not to save capitalism from itself. The goal is to save us from it. And for the first time In 50 years, half a century, the people of the United States, huge numbers of them, are ready to resume the conversation that we should have had all those 50 years. What about the capitalist system? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? And let us dare ask the question, can we do better than this system now that we know just how awful it can get? I think we're ready, and therefore for me, and I know this comes across because so many of you tell me that, am I talking about scary things? Yes. But do you pick up a note of optimism and hope? You betcha. That's a quote from Mrs. Palin. I do see this as a time of extraordinary opportunity. And a full house here tonight is another piece of evidence. And the event at Sonoma State, that's another piece of evidence. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you found enough caustic wit for the evening.
Kind of going back to your conversation of scapegoating immigrants. The last few weeks, much of the conversation has been centered on immigration reform, Trump's travel ban, aka Muslim ban, and increased raids by ICE agents, and the ongoing talk of building a wall along the US-Mexico border. The national conversation from the right has centered on a narrative that suggests that undocumented immigrants are costing US citizens jobs and are bad for the US economy. President Donald Trump has called for a crackdown on illegal immigrants, saying, quote, they compete directly against vulnerable American workers. How much of that immigration capital or immigrant capital, undocumented workforce is really taking from Black and poor whites? And I say Black and poor whites because through that conversation, minority communities have been pitted against one another. And I want to kind of get to the core of it, like what's the numbers? How much of that is really taking away from those communities, or is this just a level of another alternative fact?
Sure. Can folks hear me? Is it right? Okay. To answer this properly, you kind of have to take a step back and not let yourself be caught up in a classic scapegoating gambit. You know, when Mr. Trump talks about immigration, think to yourself advertising. Mm-hmm. And here's what I mean. When you encounter advertising in the newspaper or on television or wherever you encounter it, you get yourself ready psychologically. You know that the announcer is going to tell you 3 or 4 good things about a product, hide all the bad things, because they're not interested in informing you. They're interested in getting money out of your pocket to buy whatever it is they sell. And you know that. And you therefore don't take it seriously the way you would if you were talking with a human being who was trying to talk to you about the pluses and minuses, the strengths and weaknesses of something. So let me try to show you what is not being told about immigrants, that all economic analysis has taught for centuries. Every human being is a cost to the society in which he or she lives, pretty much for the first 20 years of your life. You have to be fed, you have to be clothed, you have to be sheltered, you have to be educated. An enormous amount of wealth is poured into you that you don't contribute to 1 iota. You don't do any work. Then when you get to be 20 years of age, more or less, you start contributing. Most immigrants to the United States come in the ages of 20 to 30. Guess what? The cost of making them productive has been borne by the countries from which they come who couldn't afford it. And their productive period is given to the United States, which doesn't need it. It is absurd because it is a subsidy of the rich by the poor. To talk about immigration and not see that is an advertiser's hustle. It's not letting you understand the enormous contribution. That's why in many countries this all is called a brain drain, because you are losing the people into which you have poured your teaching resources, your nurturant resources, by the parents, by the school teachers, by the ministers, who then come here to give you the fruits of what they've learned and what they can create. It is an enormous subsidy of the rich by the poor, and ought to be some humility here in the United States of great gratitude and thanks for what the immigrant brings. Number two. Folks, this has got nothing to do with me. Textbooks on this subject abound in these stories. It is Mr. Trump's either ignorance or the need to make the scapegoating, and I think it's the latter, that makes it necessary to act like this never occurred to the folks who make these decisions. We also have a problem in the United States of what's called a population bubble. An awful lot of us did something, which of course I won't discuss, that produced a lot of babies at a certain time. And those babies we call now, you know, the baby boomers and all that, and they are now reaching retirement age. Okay, we have a Social Security system that says we're going to give you, when you reach age 65, 66, a certain amount of money. And that's coming from the people who are younger, and they putting in the wealth into the Social Security system, but being young, they don't pull anything out. In order for the old to pull out, they've got to be young ones putting in. We don't have enough young ones. Unless, of course, you count the immigrants who come in as young people and push money in, without which the old ones couldn't get it out. Because that's the way the Social Security, it's called a pay-as-you-go system. It's a particular kind of Social Security system. It's the one we have. And the immigrants are making a major contribution to putting in that which the social safety net provides for everybody else. Another reason to say, thank you, immigrants. You're helping us out in a big way. Then there are all the industries that cannot work without immigrants because they've adapted to the availability of immigrants for the last 30 to 40 years. Restaurant industry, agriculture of all kinds, menial labor of all kinds, on and on, hospital work. It's a long list. There's no recognition. What in the world is going to happen to these institutions and our payment of the costs for those institutions if you remove or make it difficult for immigrants to function? Immigrants also make money here, which they send back to their families, which are major bases for social stability in those societies. Mexico, for example, is a major country dependent on what's called remittances, money that is sent back. No one knows what is going to happen to the Mexican economy as that flow dries up. Think of it this way. Mexico was able to export people for whom it had no work, and got in return a massive flow of money from the people working in the United States who sent it back home. What we're doing now is reversing that, sending back the people for whom there are no jobs without sending back any more money, without which there's no Mexico. This is very, very serious. The United States doesn't live in a vacuum. It has a southern neighbor, and if that society implodes because of the absurd need of a government in this country to make believe its problems have to do with those 5 to 10 million folks from Mexico, you're going to see a level of problem that makes our current situation look like nothing. Any honest discussion of immigration would have to look at the costs and the benefits. They are many and they are complicated. What you're getting from Washington is simply a hyped level of cost and no discussion at all of the benefits. And that's an advertising hustle. That's not a political conversation. Last point. New York City, I believe, is the city with the largest single population of both documented and undocumented immigrants. New York City has seen the number of immigrants go straight up like a line for the last 30 years, and the crime rate in New York City has gone down like a shot over the exact same period. The only clear measure we have of the relationship between immigrants and crime indicates the exact opposite of what Mr. Trump has asserted. He simply asserts it, as we know he does. He repeats it, as we know he does. He gets the media attention, as we know he does. But meanwhile, the actual statistics, which are produced in a routine way, indicate that it's not the case. And as I tried to show on my last radio program, the argument for why this is not hard to find. Immigrants move, they have no money, they move into the poorest neighborhoods, they populate them with large numbers of people, and the whole crime situation starts to erode because there are people there and they're active and they have their families, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the conditions for the crime that we had before actually go down. Then, too, the question you put up is exactly right. Who do they compete with, since immigrants do compete with some people, and it tends to be certain parts of the population, not other parts of the population, which an honest conversation would go. And anybody who really cares about our society would understand. Immigrants are brought to this country because the conditions in their country are unbearable. I should be honest. I'm the child of 2 immigrant refugees who came to the United States to save their lives. My father was French and my mother was German. So I grew up, my sympathies are shaped by my life, as is everybody else's. But I can assure you that they only left because it was a matter of life or death. They left because capitalism imploded in Europe and it turned to fascism as a way of trying to solve the problem. So they came here. That's why they came. If anyone cared, they would have created for them the jobs here that would allow them to have a decent life for a while without penalizing the American working class by making them compete. That's a ploy that advantages the employer. It's neither necessary nor humane, and it's nothing that a left-wing, self-conscious would ever permit. Bring the refugees, make a proper program for them, then there isn't the question of the struggle because you've taken this step. We have a ruling class in America, and I don't mind using the phrase, that loves to play the following game. Bring in poor immigrants who threaten the jobs of at least some people, and then scold the angry people who've lost their jobs for not being more open-armed about the refugees. Hey, folks, you brought the refugees here for reasons you know real well. You want to be generous? Be our guest. But don't do your generosity on somebody else's back. That's cruel, and that's not justifiable.
Yeah. In your talk, you mentioned Betsy DeVos, right? And we all understand the direction of privatization of education, right? We know where things are headed, but then also if we look at Trump's cabinet selections, right? We're talking about a billionaires club. We're talking about the wealthiest of the wealthiest that are actually in the space of guiding and making a lot of decisions that will ultimately impact everyone in this room, whether you realize it or not. I wanted to ask you this question. For a few minutes, maybe you can explore the devastating consequences of Trump's crony capitalism. And then also, when you talked about what do we do, maybe you can provide us with a little bit more action plans. Because immediately when you were talking, I was thinking about South Africa and apartheid and that divestment movement and what the change by just simply removing the dollar, right, or saying no, enough is enough, it created social change, not just within that infrastructure, but internationally, right? So I think there's things that we can do that people have moved away from, but maybe if you can provide this audience while they're here with some clear action steps, some clear plans of action that could actually make a difference.
Okay, let me respond to the crony capitalism, the DeVos, the Trump, with a little arithmetic, real simple. Mr. Trump tells us he's a billionaire. We can't actually be sure because we would need the tax returns, which he doesn't release, in order to know at least what he tells the government, whatever that may may imply or not in terms of his assets. But let's assume he has $1 billion, which, as billionaires go, isn't all that much. Mr. Gates, Mr. Warren Buffett, and folks like that have tens of billions of dollars. But let's just assume you have $1 billion. If you are a $1 billion man or woman in this culture, you will not invest that money yourself because you don't know how to do that real well, and it makes no sense for you, who are busy with other things, to do that. So you will give it to a specialized firm that invests the money for you. Those firms have a number of names, but the one you've probably heard most often would be hedge fund. It's a group of people who invest your money for you, and they get a fee and a cut of how well they do for you in payment for doing that. And a typical hedge fund in New York today will say to a billionaire, we can pretty well assure you at least a net of 5% per year, possibly much more, but at least, you know, we'll give you 5%, and most of them will do that or better. So let's do the arithmetic. 5%, you have $1 billion. That means you make $50 million a year. That means you get $1 million a week. The reason those people don't buy lottery tickets is they don't need to. They get $1 million every week forever. No matter what they do in that week. They could be sleeping. They could be walking the neighborhood dogs. They could be skiing. It doesn't matter, because their income is not connected to labor that they do. Their income is connected to wealth that they own. There is no way on earth a human being who lives that kind of life, $1 million every week, no matter what. Even when it rains like it does here in California, you make that money. They don't look at the world the same way you and I do. They can't possibly. Mr. Trump has surrounded himself who see the world by people who see the world through those lenses of that kind of a life. They have no idea what public schools are. They could care less. They don't live in the world of a public school with any of its problems. They try to decide which of the expensive private schools in their environment they wish to have the chauffeur take their children to. It's a different existence, and it shapes the society, because every company that wants to make a profit seeks to pander to those people, because that's the best way to get a profit, since they have all that money to spend, and the whole society is focused on them. So what would be the first thing we do? Well, one of the first things we do is to question the legitimacy of such an arrangement. What is that? And there's an easy way to do this, which we've already done in the United States. I don't have the imagination to answer this good question with new ideas, but I can give you some old ones. In 1994, Roosevelt sent a message, the annual State of the Union message, to the Congress. He proposed there that the income tax rate on the richest Americans at that time, and that would be people who earned over $25,000 a year. Back then, that would be about $400,000 a year today. That every dollar over $25,000, the income tax rate would be 100%. I didn't make that up. I didn't make that up. That was the official proposal of the President of the United States at that time. That was what we would nowadays call a maximum income law. It meant nobody could earn more than $25,000, because whatever you earned over that, you wouldn't get. End of story. This was sent to the Congress. The Republicans went ballistic. You know, you all know what that means. You see that now. And they fought and they yelled and they screamed, and then a final deal was made. And in the final deal, the top income tax rate, 1944, was 94%. Out of every dollar over 25,000, you sent Uncle Sam 94 cents, you kept 6 cents. Now, come on, that was a law passed by the Congress, signed by the president. Don't tell me we can't do that. Of course we can do that. And what would it mean if we had a campaign in the United States that listed 10 of the most egregious social problems we have? People living without homes, people living in terrible conditions of their schools and so on, and said, these people's lives can be transformed if we don't let anybody have more than $100 million, or some staggering sum. But wait a minute, we have so many people with so much money that a rule like that would transform the lives of millions of our fellow citizens. These are not complex or difficult, and they're not new. There just needs to be the momentum of people saying, we've had enough. And believe me, here's the final irony of it. If we make a movement like that, we won't need to convince them to do it. They will come to us in the hopes that if we give them half a chance, we'll just take the second billion, we'll leave them with the first. Because that's less scary to them than losing it all. And so the whole name of the game will shift. Here's the second one, then I'll stop, because I could go on all night. We have, and this is a favorite target of mine, so my apologies to those of you who've heard it before. We have some very wealthy universities in this country. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, you know. These institutions sit on tens of billions of dollars. Harvard has about 36 billion, Yale has about 25 billion, and so on. These are schools of education. They don't need that money, they simply accumulate it, which they've been doing, which is why they have so much. What is this about? They don't pay any taxes. What? That's right. They don't pay, one more time, they don't pay any taxes. And all of you should be aware, they get all the same services you do. The police come when they call, the fire department comes when it calls, the schools educate the children they hire as workers. They get all the benefits of public services, but they don't pay for them. If they get the services and don't pay for them, it means you pay for them. You subsidize Harvard. There's something wrong with that picture. It ought to be the other way around. There's no need for this. There is no need for this. Not only do they get no taxes to pay, but the largest single source of money for places like Harvard and Yale, places I went to school, I know, is they get government grants to do all kinds of research. They don't pay taxes, they get the government money, your taxes. They are laughing all the way to the bank. And it's a bank they probably own. So this is not complicated. A handful of us sitting down can work out the thing. It's only a question of the momentum and the strength of the demands of people for these things. Then the conversation becomes serious. Our problem is not coming up with the particulars. Our problem is, do we have the commitment, the compassion, the muscle of political power? There, my hat goes off to Bernie. Before Bernie, we wondered, could the mass of people ever contend with the concentrated wealth of the 1%? The answer is, yeah, we could. If everybody gives 27 or whatever the average number was, or $27 or something in that neighborhood, it turns out that millions of people putting it all together can suddenly produce quite a budget for a candidate. There's a lesson in that. Just like we've just asked you to help sustain KPFA and democracy at work, we are beginning to show that yes, the power is there if we can overcome the 50 years of hibernation, of taboo against this kind of thinking and acting, and begin to move. We're getting closer with each passing week. It's just terribly frustrating that we're not yet there.
But you're also talking about, okay, so I'm listening, it's like long-term strategy, But my question was also centered around short-term strategies. I'm thinking about millennials, Black Lives Matter. There's different movements and different ways that people are actually addressing some of these things and systems that are at play that don't benefit us, right? But for a young person who's a millennial in this room who wants to be able to move in a direction that challenges capitalism, what can we do right now that's not a long-term strategy? I agree with what you're saying, but something that they can do immediately. You know, what would that look like?
There's also a lot of non-millennials in here who don't
Well, I say millennials because the reality is when we think about movements and organizing and who's actually leading stuff and helping to push the change, it's the younger population. But I think once we see a lot of those folks doing it, a lot of people get on board, right? And I'm assuming because a lot of you are in the room that you're already on board, but it would be really nice from this to hear from Professor Wolff some immediate things that folks can do.
Okay, here's a couple. A page from the Roosevelt years, a public jobs program. It's long overdue to go to the young people of America particularly, but to the older ones too. And here's a whole menu of jobs, things that need to be done here in the United States today, whether it's rebuilding Detroit or dealing with the greening or the proper ecological treatment that our building structures need, 100 other things. Jobs today for everybody who doesn't have a job or who wants to leave their private sector job to do something socially useful, to be paid a proper salary, do it the way we did it in the 1930s and charge it to the corporations and the rich who paid for it last time. There's the program, and the precedent is what we did in the United States today. It would transform the lives, particularly of those who are having the hardest time starting up on the job ladder, getting the skills, and so forth. We have the people to do it. We have the social needs to do it. We have all the equipment to do it. That's it. That's a demand that millions, particularly of young people, who could become leaders in achieving. Why don't we do that?
All right. Another question from the audience. One of your radio broadcasts, you mentioned that if things got really bad, the banks could take over savings accounts. Does this apply to credit unions as well?
No, it doesn't apply to credit unions, but it does apply to banks. It's called a bail-in. It is the difference of a bail-out. In a bail-out, when a bank fails and cannot honor its commitments, for example, to its bondholders or its shareholders or its depositors, can't give them the money back, they go to the government to help them out. That's what happened in 2008 all over the world. And that's called a bailout. The politicians didn't want that to happen again because they got the blame, since they were the politicians, of having provided these private banks with the money that got them out of the pickle, but put us as taxpayers in the pickle because we were picking up the tab. So they became big advocates that the government will not bail you out. Okay, said the banks, how about then a bail-in? You scratch your head. What's a bail-in? Here we go, folks. If there are wholesale collapses of banks and we wipe out their shareholders, we basically say you don't own anything anymore, and we even wipe out their bondholders. We will not pay back the debts that we've incurred by selling bonds to the public. If that isn't enough, ready? Here we go. It's the law in this country. The banks can forcibly, without your permission, take your deposits. They can literally, what's technically called, convert your deposit from a deposit that you have the right to take out at will into a share in the company, which they can be worth something or nothing, and which you can only get for it as much as you can convince somebody else to give you for it, like any other share of stock. In other words, your deposits become the way for a bank to survive when it has made so many mistakes that it can't get it from its shareholders, it can't get it from its bondholders, and the politicians won't do it. Do you understand? The system is fixing itself at your expense. Capitalism is in trouble and solving the problem by sticking it to you. That's why if you're afraid of acting politically, I have to tell you that you should be at least as afraid of not acting politically, given what's happening.
Another question. Today I heard on KPFA William Ingadall, I think that's how you pronounce the name, but William, speak about the fact that just after Abe Lincoln and JFK issued interest-free money, they both were assassinated. Could you explain that better, interest-free money?
Yes. It's not so easy to do in a short amount of time. I hope Mr. Engdahl explained it on the radio for those of you that heard it. The way money is created in the United States is as debt. That's a little bit hard to understand, but that's in fact how it's done. If you go to a bank and you take out a loan as a business or an individual, what the bank does is create an account for you. It says you're borrowing $100,000, here's an account, you can now write checks against $100,000. Does the bank have to have any money to do that? No. But you owe the money that is in that account because it's a loan. So new money is created, you can write checks, as debt, because the money you're writing is an immediate debt you have to somebody else. The argument, and the same thing is when the government prints the money, because it gives it to the banks as a loan, and so it's the same thing. The argument has been made that an economy is encumbered by debts, by all that network of obligations we have when we borrow money. It is very dangerous in hard times. You can't pay it back, and then you make decisions you would not have made if you were not in debt. And that therefore, money should be created not as debt, but simply knowing that we need money to run an economy, that the government would make it available to large numbers of people when we need to have more money in circulation. It has sometimes also gone by the name helicopter money, which comes from an interesting idea that when an economy needs more money, it would arrange to print it, to fly helicopters over selected cities, and to open them up, having told us all, next Thursday at 11, be prepared with a garbage bag, stand outside, and see how well you can do. Because if what the goal is to have more money in the economy, that's just as practical a way of doing it as lending it to businesses and to banks. When the government lends to businesses and banks, they control the story. If it were done by helicopters, we, who had the big bags, would in fact get the money, and we could have a different city each week. You can imagine the kind of vacation that would imply for people on the appropriate day. But the point of fact is there's a serious argument that you don't want the creation of money that an economy needs to be hooked into debt. And the reason that was done was to convenience the banks, and we shouldn't be running a monetary system that conveniences the banks. It's a sub-case, it's a particular case of having an economy we all depend on be run by institutions whose primary goal is to make profit for a handful of people. That's a crazy way to organize an economic system that's supposed to help us all by putting it in the hands of people whose first priority is their own profit.
All right, so with that said, let's conclude with our discussion. I want to provide the space for people to interact with you. Ken is looking very stressed right there, so I want to make sure that we wrap things up. But then also, I want to remind folks that you can always tune in and check out Economic Update. As Professor Wolff mentioned, heard now 75 different radio stations, so you can definitely check. And actually ask those questions to him, email and directly contact him. So again, let's give it up for Professor Richard Wolff.